house price to income ratio in my city, which is measured by the median house price divided by median annual household income, is less than 3, between 3 and 5, between 5 and 10, more than 10. So what we're measuring here is how many years of my household income I need to save in order to be able to buy an average house that is provided in the market. It's quite clear that in many of your cities here, households have to save quite a lot of years of their household income in order to be able to purchase an average housing that is offered in the market. And I see quite a significant amount more than 10. And I'll show you the surprises we have with the global survey we did with 200 cities. All right, 97 respondents, we're pretty good. Next, I am a homeowner, I am a tenant. So we're talking about affordable housing here, but we have a large population of tenants. So rental housing should also be affordable if I see the configuration of the room. But we're talking very much about home ownership. Sometimes home ownership, as you showed, it takes more than 10 years for me to save in order to be able to purchase an affordable housing in the market. So how do we do that? 106 people responded. Now the last one, what is the most critical housing problem in the city where you live? Lack of surplus land, housing prices too high, housing finances are unavailable, incomes are low, excessive regulations, and so on. House price is too high, land price too high. None of the above is not popular. Housing finance seems to be available, but land and housing prices are too high, and incomes are a little bit low. So we have wealthy people that face a problem because housing price is too high and land price is high, because incomes are not so low. Oh, that's interesting. And we have a lot of tenants, so perhaps you want to move from rental to ownership. So the system needs to provide you the mechanism that you can move in the ladder and allow those starters in the market to rent housing and fuel the economy. Okay, thank you. Very good response. I think that's it. Yeah, that's it. You can send the results to yourself if you type there your email. Can I move my presentation now, please? The PowerPoint. I put here my my clock so that Okay, so here we are. My name is Claudio Acioly, and I'm going through some experiences that I have the opportunity to work in the world, but also certain experiences that I've been following very close as a practitioner. But I know it looks redundant in a housing forum like that to ask what do we mean by housing, but we need to remind ourselves that we're talking much more than just bricks, mortars, and a roof. So we're talking about a very complex economic system that interconnects with each other: supply of land, supply of infrastructure, finance, building materials, labor, and how this connected through a regulatory and institutional framework that in the end connects through policies and actions, and what we have in the end is affordable and adequate housing. That's what we're talking about, not only the house, not only the plot, it's something much more complex. Let's keep ourselves really connected with that idea that affordable housing is much more than just the building. Now, for ourselves, and the government of Kenya, together with more than 100 countries, have committed themselves in 1996 and in 2016 to promote the full and progressive realization of the right to adequate housing. But what is right to adequate housing? Well, the International Covenants of Socioeconomic and Cultural Rights, which have been ratified by many countries, I don't know whether the government of Kenya has ratified or not, but recognize the 7 dimensions of adequacy, from security of tenure to cultural adequacy. And I want to call yourself something important: affordability. Affordability is part of the right to adequate housing. So housing, as you see the definition, all that has to come at an affordable price to the people, so that you do not exclude those who cannot afford from development opportunities. Now, and we see more and more of these statements. So denying people access to affordable housing is, of course, a serious breach of basic human rights. Now, the international community, and Kenya included, have adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, the Agenda 2030, and there we have Goal 11 that says, 11.1, by 2030, ensure access for all to adequate, safe, and affordable housing and slum upgrading with service and so on. So we are working with this idea that we need to put the new urban agenda that has been adopted in 2016, but also using housing as a implementing element to deliver the Agenda 2030. Now, we are talking about housing at the center of development policies, and particularly urbanization. So how do we connect all that into delivering affordable housing opportunities? Because we know, and in 200 sample of cities that we have, as you can see there, on average, housing occupies 55% of land cover in all these cities. So as you see, the typology of housing will determine the shape and form of cities. So how do we make housing affordable then? So understanding the supply and demand is important. So where do we put our policies? In the supply side? So you want to decrease, let's say, the housing production cost? Or do we go to family income, like most European countries nowadays? They focus their policy on enabling the demand side to afford different options that are provided in the market through different mechanisms. So if we go more complex, you can see that there are many policies, many measures that make the end point of my commitment of my income to a certain share of my available income to pay regularly for housing. But I can also have other measures, including housing vouchers, including bonus, including some subsidies, so that I increase the ability to pay of the demand side. So, of course, we have to work on these two sides. We cannot only work on one side. So we have a global affordability crisis, and this is the shocking news I'm bringing to you, because I'm bringing a sample that we did out of 4,600 cities of more than 100,000 inhabitants. We selected these 200 cities that represent our urbanized planet, and this is the result that they came out. First, let's define housing affordability. It's measured by comparison of house price to household incomes. As we saw in the query, median house price divided by median annual gross pre-tax household income is the median multiple, is a house price to income ratio that is widely used in many parts of the world. And areas rated as affordable, housing price should not exceed 3 times gross annual household income. So you, in your answers, you already told that the city where you live, housing is not affordable. More than 10 times. So where are people going if they cannot afford housing? They don't have the ability to pay for housing. They go to the streets, they go to the slums, they overcrowd, they go to rooftops, depends on the city, they occupy even under the bridge. So people have to live if they are in the city and they cannot pay for housing. So these are the 200 cities. Each column is a city. And you can see right there on the top is 12.1, which is similar from the cities where you pointed out here. And only this very small here, very tiny on the left bottom, is the cities where is below 3. All the other cities, housing is considered unaffordable. So where do people live if they cannot afford home ownership? So then we went to what? Rental housing. There is a big amount of people here renting housing. And our threshold is 25% of household income is considered as an affordable rent, which means households commit 25% of their income to rent. The Dutch, for example, they allow up to 29%. The World Bank considers sometimes 30%, but we have the threshold of 25%. And you can see there we have more cities that on the red line is 25%. So we have more cities that are below 25%. But we have an enormous amount of people, including that. Can you imagine that city on the top, 58% of household income committed to rent? Where do you find money to eat, to buy food, to get books for your children, etc.? Now here's the shocking news then. So we put up the cities and we put them upside down the data and said, let's divide the cities by income. Low income, middle upper income, high income. Guess what? Look at that. 3. All cities. House price to income ratio about 3, which means in all 200 cities, housing is not affordable. So let's go to rent. Same thing. All cities. Rents are above 25%. Where are people living? Where are they going to? Okay, then we look at demography. Very interesting survey. 309 markets in the world, and these are the countries, different metropolitan areas, etc. And guess what? The result? All cities above 3. So it's a housing affordability crisis. And as I showed you, the challenge is how do we put the policy in the demand side, in the supply side? How do we ensure that people are able to pay in location and size and standard that they are able to pay? So conclusions. The main message that unaffordable housing is not an unavoidable fatality linked to economic success. Some cities achieve high demographic and economic growth without abnormal housing inflation. High housing prices mislocate resources toward real estate at the expense of the rest of the economy. This mislocation could eventually significantly slow down economic growth and cause a housing bubble to burst, freezing investments in the entire economy, because we know housing and the economy is so closely associated. If something goes wrong in the housing sector, we know the economy is tumbling. So conclusion, affordability, house price to income ratio above 3 in the majority of cities. Accessibility to affordable housing is largely obstructed. Access to housing via home ownership and rent is hampered. The housing sector in many cities is not functioning well, with restricted options for several income groups and distortions reflected on the form and structure of cities. When we look at Nairobi, when we look at Kisumu, and we know that the issue of housing affordability has a tremendous impact on overcrowding, formal housing, slums, poor housing management, high land prices, spatial exclusion, criminality, and, well, just name it. So we argue very strongly that the lack of affordable housing options leads to informal urbanization, growth of slums, which is a direct physical manifestation in the city. What we see there is closely related to housing. And this is the beauty and the complexity of working in housing that brings us together to find ways on how do we solve the puzzles that we have. Now, then, just to show you that this is not an easy thing, so the scale of the problem calls. No, the data in Kenya says that roughly 50% of urban Kenyans live in slum conditions, which is something that is not different than we found in many places of the world. As you can see in Africa, in red, 1 out of 2 people living in urban areas in African cities live in slum conditions. How can we make housing affordable for people not to go towards the slum or informal housing? And what is shocking more is that more and more we see middle income, people with available documented income living in slum conditions because there are no opportunities and there are not mechanisms of housing finance that could make people eligible to some kind of access to credit. So the situation in the world is like that. 1 out of 4 live in these conditions. So we have the divided city in different places, and we have also Nairobi, Kibera, for some of you who know. Now, the situation we're measuring, and we're doing now a new measure for 2020, but you can see that more than 70% of African living in urban areas are living in these conditions. So how do we make housing affordability to work for people who are driven to these conditions? Is it because they're poor? Well, we're showing that in some slums of India, for example, 40% of the people would be able to afford some kind of credit and opportunity to buy a house. So how do we do that? We are saying the following. We need to address the situation of slums of informal housing production by improving the conditions of those slums that are possible to be improved. So you produce housing opportunities without investing in the housing itself. And we create preventive policies, and then comes to our situation, which is planning before development, unlocking land delivery for planned urbanization, unlocking housing finance, policies to bring housing solutions to scale, and so on. So we're saying this, we need to improve the situation in the existing slums where it's possible, so that we give citizenship, we give legality, we give infrastructure at a cost, obviously, and people will start paying for the services that they receive. And on the other hand, we produce policies that deliver new housing or improve the conditions and transform the conditions in the existing stock by different policies, by different measures. So this is what we are advocating. So improve and prevent as part of one single policy. Now, what are we talking about then? First, improving and creating opportunities for new households, for new families that are coming. So this condition, okay, my 20 minutes have done, so I have to conclude. I'll browse through some of the countries so I can conclude my story. So one of the things is about the scale in diversity of price, location, size, standard, and typology. We need to move in that direction in hand with improving the conditions of those slums where they are in conditions to be improved. Unlock land for housing, service land supply at scale. Citywide slum upgrading, not little project here, little project there, but program, citywide. Let's look, this cannot be because this land is problematic, flooded, etc., or legal issues. We need to provide opportunities, so we do human-related relocation so people improve their life and improving their housing. Unlocking housing finance, different forms of self-finance, including the fiscal elements of property tax, data and information. We cannot continue working in our cities where the wind blows, the minister or the mayor decides. We need data, good data. We need information, and we need to create a culture of collecting information that allow us to design policies that are well-informed and evidence-based. So, learning from Singapore, very briefly on the things we're working with. I've been working with Singapore for the last 4 years and visiting their cities. So, housing at the center, the transformation they came from a slum country or a slum city to the city we know today in 60 years, it has with the fact that they put housing at the center of their policy. They intervene legally on a compulsory land acquisition act to make sure that land is available for urbanization. They created the Housing Provident Fund, the National Provident, and a very strong urban planning and design to shape urbanization. Now, this is an interesting model because it creates a fund where Singaporeans don't have pension, but they have the Provident Fund. And the Provident Fund is a compulsory contribution of all employees and all employers. Up to 17% is put on this fund, and nowadays you can use for education, for health, but mainly for housing. And then you have a certain solution in terms of these initiatives. Now, what are the key lessons? Legal provision for land supply, strong intervention. Landowners could not be just holding there, I want my land to, no. There is a collective benefit that is higher than the individual property rights regime. And this is very tricky and political, as you can imagine. Housing fund and guarantees to housing finance. A strong link between planning, land allocation, housing development, and the promotion of the housing sector as a wealth generator. And finally, let me show you another case, because it's very nice to see that more than half of the group is tenant. So here we have, and I want you to think at the end of my session on the following paradox. Think about it. How can you explain that the wealthiest countries in the world have a large percentage of their housing stock in rented occupation? And in the poorest countries in the world, we promote home ownership as a single tenure policy. Wow, how can it be? Yeah, it's, paradox. Think about it. I have some ideas, but anyhow, I work for the UN, so I cannot be a consultant and, charge you, so it's free of charge. Okay, how did they do that in the Netherlands? Housing at the center of urban policy. So the 1901 Housing Act, the oldest housing act in the world, that created a private entity that builds for the public good. The housing associations that build social housing. They became the biggest and largest and richest social entrepreneurs in the world. In a certain moment, they had in asset 94 billion euro in assets. Can you imagine? So the National Planning Framework, the National Housing Fund, and the National Guarantee Fund for Social Housing. And when we say social housing, social rental housing. At the moment, the Netherlands has 46% to 44% of the housing stock is in rented accommodation. And the rental stock, 75% is for the housing association, belongs to the housing association. So I think I showed these two examples because some people in the discussions were talking about that, but I'm not going to go in details because my time is over. But the interesting thing is that the housing associations now, they can not only build houses, they are also responsible for the surrounding space, for neighborhood, for quality of life, for things that complement the residential space. Okay, so what are the key lessons? A legal provision, the Housing Act, government funding and guarantees, a self-regulated sector of housing associations, the private entities that build for the public good, and the promotion of social rental sector to enable access to affordable housing for those who cannot afford through the market. So I will stop here, but I had a lot of interesting story for you to compare these different countries, but the time is short, we kind of delay. So I think they will put the presentation on the website, I believe, and then you will see there is things about Chile, what we learned from Chile, from Mexico. Is a disaster in Mexico. They produced during 12 years between 400 and 600,000 units a year. Very strong private developers, very strong government, a housing fund, but when we went there to do the housing profile, I was responsible for that. Guess what we found? 4.9 million units vacant, vandalized, semi-occupied. 4.9, let's say 5 million, 16% of the stock produced. How do you explain that? Location, location, location. You put housing, affordable housing, in the periphery where land is cheap, you are creating another headache for government policy. So thank you and enjoy the discussion.